Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Miller Center and welcome to 2026. For regular Miller Center participants, attendees, visitors, friends, guests, you're become used to the Miller Center's Ukraine War Room over the last 3 and nearly 4 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This group is a terrific collection of scholars from across the University of Virginia and experts and practitioners from beyond who help us analyze those events. The group has been focusing on a range of other international topics, and with the Trump administration's action in Venezuela, pulling out President Maduro and bringing him to charges in the United States, we consulted quickly over the holidays and decided to pull together a webinar focused on this recent set of events, what prompted it, what it means, and where it may be going. For this week's conversation, we've also invited a guest who is really an alumnus of the Miller Center. Dan Restrepo is a graduate of the University of Virginia. He's worked in all three branches of government with a law degree from another esteemed university, but he was also a Miller Center intern when he was an undergraduate here at UVA. In two previous presidential administrations, the Clinton and Obama administrations, he served on the national security staff as an advisor on Latin American issues, with a range of other engagements and pieces of expertise. So for today's conversation, and for those who have followed the War Room in the past, we don't introduce all the panelists at once. We do them as we bring them into the conversation. We're going to start with Dan and then work our way around the War Room Zoom. We invite you to submit questions using the Q&A function on your at-home Zoom screen. Those questions will come to me, and I'll pose them to our participants as the conversation goes along. So with that, Dan, we're delighted to have you with us. And just to kick it off, the President Trump and his team deemed this a legal operation with support from the military, for reasons maybe you can help us explain and unpack. But more broadly than that, why? I mean, there was perhaps some legal justification for this, but there are other reasons, including reasons the administration has put out there for pursuing this particular activity. Why are we doing this? And do the formal pronouncements match up with broader other motivations that may be driving the administration?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me, Bill. The Miller Center is near and dear to my heart, so it's nice to be back, albeit virtually. I think you have to start at the general and kind of go to the specific in terms of what's motivating this. And I think this kind of starts, downstream, and I use that pun intentionally, to the kind of Trump sphere of influence theory of the case that was laid out in the national security strategy. This notion that great powers can and should exercise dominion in parts of the world that belong to them. And for the Trump team in the NSS, in the national security strategy, they lay out very clearly that the United States is and should be the dominant power in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, and that we should exercise dominion accordingly. And for, among other things, the pursuit of resources, and to deny resources to our global competitors. And so I think kind of at the broadest level, that's the why behind the particular action vis-a-vis Venezuela. Then the president's been very clear, kind of boiled that down to this was about oil. He has said so repeatedly since the press conference, actually since he went on Fox News via teleconference before laying out kind of more broadly in his press conference over the weekend. It had started, the actions in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific had started with a justification around being part of a counter-narcotics operation, a very robust one, with dubious legality as well. I think we'll get into the legality of all of this as we go forward. But he's been pretty clear that this is about resources and about controlling the Venezuelan oil sector, the world's largest proven reserves, which says more than is actually there because of the nature of Venezuelan oil, the nature of the sector. But again, I think we can unpack that as we go forward. I think for Secretary of State Rubio, this is largely a means to an end. He has also started presenting the oil as a means to an end, but they're different ends. The oil is, as Secretary Rubio, and the control of oil is essentially to coerce the regime, because all we did was remove one member of the regime when we arrested Nicolas Maduro. To coerce the regime to cooperate with the United States in among other things. One is first stabilizing the country, but there's also kind of this nebulous notion of a transition at some point. That's something that Rubio talks about that the president doesn't, quite frankly. When the president gets asked about it, he just goes back to oil. For Rubio, I think it is also at a very personal level, a means to an end to precipitate regime change in Cuba. This notion that if you can cut off the oil supply from Venezuela to Cuba, although Venezuela is no longer Cuba's largest oil supplier, as a lot of folks learned this week, it's actually Mexico, that you can precipitate the ultimate collapse of the regime in Cuba, which is something for Marco Rubio, as a Cuban American, as a member, somebody who was raised in the exile community, has been kind of an animating portion of his politics and his public life, really since he arrived on the national scene, actually since before he arrived on the national scene, as he rose through the ranks of politics in South Florida and then national politics. So I think there's broader theories here of influence. It's about resources and second order, particularly for the Secretary of State, about further destabilizing the situation in Cuba.
Thanks, Dan. I want to bring in Alan Stam. Alan is a senior fellow with us, was the dean of UVA's Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, a scholar of leadership as well as national security and military strategy. Alan, you wrote a terrific Substack essay for the Miller Center on the new Monroe Doctrine. So Dan's laid out the sort of immediate driving concern, including the national security strategies. Does that line up with your sense of how the Trump administration views this new Monroe Doctrine?
Yeah,
and what does that tell us about the motivations of the activity?
And I'll sort of do it in reverse order of the way that Dan did it. And so we'll start with the immediate. So one way to think about this is in the sense of sort of mixed motives. There's the old saw, politics makes for strange bedfellows. And, you know, we saw this most clearly perhaps in the lead up to the war in Iraq in 2003. And I think there's an aspect of that today in Venezuela particularly. So as Dan pointed out, Secretary Rubio has been talking about Latin America, Cuba, Venezuela for 15 years. This was a cornerstone of his senatorial campaign several years ago. Big oil, not shale producers, but big oil, Exxon, Chevron, Mobil, have an interest in this. Big oil refiners in Texas, refineries have a Texas in Venezuela, heavy crude versus the kind of crude that comes out of the fracking and shale in Oklahoma and Texas. And so we have there's a group of different interests, all of whom have a narrow interest in a change of leadership in Venezuela because of the nationalization of the oil industry several years ago. And this fits in part and parcel with changing or evolving U.S. policy towards Brazil with regard to rare earths metals, changing policy towards Peru with regard to lithium for batteries and so forth. So I agree completely with Dan in the short run, or the immediate term, that this is being driven by very immediate material concerns, but across a broad range of constituents whose, you know, it's hard to say whether their longer term interests and whether they would cooperate over the long run. That remains to be seen. Now, stepping back a little bit to the bigger picture, the sort of Monroe Doctrine aspect of this, you know, I think it's important to think back about the historical grounding of this at the end of World War II. So at the end of World War II, the United States is by far the most powerful country on the planet. And one of the things the U.S. does at that moment, we take the opportunity to put in place a set of international institutions that we had hoped would essentially prevent World War I, World War II from ever happening again. Now, one of the aspects of that, the United Nations, the World Bank and so forth, the IMF and so forth. The thinking was that, look, the United States isn't going to be this powerful relative to the other great powers forever. But if we put in place a system of institutions that ultimately will bind them, but also bind us, we can create a system once when the United States is relatively weaker as these other countries recover, we'll have this international interlocking system of institutions that will prevent World War II, World War I from occurring again in the future. Well, there are a lot of political scientists, a lot of people today, particularly people in the Trump administration, that believe as we look at the world post-Cold War, that vision simply has failed, that it didn't lead to the type of systemic democratization that would be hoped, essentially individual great powers buying into this, having their hands tied by institutions. So then the question becomes, well, how do we manage this hegemonic transition? So again, historians going all the way back to Thucydides have talked about the dangers of these transitions from one hegemon to another, or at least the decline of a hegemon relative to other great powers. And as often as not, those types of transitions have led to major power wars, which the whole institutional framework after World War II was designed to prevent. So the question then becomes, well, what do we do? If we don't think the institutional framework's going to work, if we don't think the emergent great powers, in particular China, will work, what do we do? Well, one alternative vision is, instead of a hegemon or cooperation amongst great powers, it's a world of regions. Well, the obvious region for the United States is the Western Hemisphere. East Asia is the obvious region for China. And for the United States to manage our own share of this world of regions, we would have to get the Western Hemisphere in order. Russia in Cuba and the Caribbean, China in Venezuela, Peru, and elsewhere have become very involved in the Western Hemisphere, as the United States has largely ignored Latin America since the end of the Cold War. And so the bigger picture, and it's very hard to ascribe motives to the Trump administration. I'll preface everything I say by that. This all could be the result of an individual having read a biography of Teddy Roosevelt. We'll never know. But I think that there's a coherent big picture that leads back to this vision of a world of regions. And this is the first move in a series of consolidation of essentially the United States reestablishing a heavy big stick in the Western Hemisphere.
Thanks, Alan. That's really terrific. I want to bring in Eric Edelman and then Alex Bick. Eric and Alex have both served at the White House and State Department, and Eric, for his sins, also served as his last job in government was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Defense Department. Both have served terrifically in those positions, looking at conflicts around the world. Eric has served under presidents of both parties as ambassador for presidents of both parties, and most recently as Undersecretary of Service was in the Bush administration. So Eric, as you're watching this unfold, you're watching the justification for it, as well as the actual motivations for it. What are you seeing in terms of a legal action operated by the military? Is there almost an echo of Vladimir Putin's special military operation on what was an invasion of Ukraine?
Vladimir Putin only wishes that he could execute an operation as effectively as the U.S. military just did, Bill. I'm sorry to say.
Mm-hmm.
I largely agree with what Dan and Alan have said in terms of the motivations for this. I would maybe have a couple of nuances of difference or just additional points. One is that in terms of the operation itself, this kind of operation is the kind of use of military power that Donald Trump lives for and approves, which is a short, sharp, in and out kind of operation that has what he believes is demonstration effect that allows him to further intimidate other world leaders and bend them to his will, get them to do his bidding. And I think you can see a very dramatic example of that. I mean, in the immediate aftermath of the Maduro extraction. And I'll leave it to Bob Strong to talk about, the question of whether this was a law enforcement action or a military action. I mean, in my mind, this was a military action. I don't think there's any other way to. There was a law enforcement element included in it, but normally law enforcement actions don't involve 150 major combat aircraft and 80 to 100 civilian and other military casualties along the way. But the demonstration effect, I think, was the president in the immediate aftermath of the raid started making threats against all sorts of other countries and leaders. So there's Mexico, there's Colombia, Iran, Denmark, a NATO ally. But you could see how it works. So he at his press conference at Mar-a-Lago reiterated something he'd said earlier about Colombian President Gustavo Petro, that he has to watch his ass. Well, Petro immediately made a very conciliatory phone call yesterday to the White House to speak to the president. He's now been invited to come and talk to the president, since nothing works with this president like a tongue bath of praise, which apparently he got from Petro in the phone call. So the demonstration effect here, I don't think, should be underestimated in what Trump is trying to do. And just to fill out a little bit of what Alan was saying, the national security strategy very explicitly, as both Dan and Alan suggested, calls for a America First strategy, a retreat, very explicitly, a retreat from globalism, and undertaking responsibility for maintaining the international order, and replacing it with an emphasis on the hemisphere. Now, they kind of grandiloquently call this the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. I would point out that if you can read that document with very fine spectacles, and you will not find the Trump corollary described anywhere. And I think there's a good reason for that, because the Trump corollary really is an amalgam of what Alan's and my common teacher, the late Walter Lefebvre, would have told you was the only corollary from 1895 of the Monroe Doctrine, which said American law is fiat in the hemisphere, and the Roosevelt corollary of 1904, his presidential address or message to Congress in January 20 of 1904, in which he said the United States had extraordinary police power in the hemisphere. And that's really what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. And just to finish off on that point, I think it's important to understand that this America First strategy, again, not only is the Trump corollary not new, but this emphasis on the hemisphere as opposed to other global responsibilities is also not new. It is very much the policy of America First in the 1920s and 30s, which was hemispheric dominance, hemispheric defense, Fortress America. And whether that will be up to the task that we face in terms of competition with Russia and China in the 21st century, I think is very much an open question. Final point. I think you can be misled in thinking about this, and this goes to Alan's kind of final point about how hard it is to talk about the Trump administration because it's so reliant on the whims of one particular person. To think about this in terms of regions or spheres of influence by great powers may not even be the right way to look at it. I'm struck by a recent article in International Organization, the journal, which talks about neo-royalism. I mean, what we're really talking about now is competition among several cliques of people. Whether it's Putin's clique in Russia, Trump's clique of tech bros and family members who are enriching themselves, or the clique around Xi Jinping. It's not so much about national interest anymore, I don't think. I think it's more about how these cliques see their own interest in staying in power.
Eric, I want to circle back in a second to you on that question, but I want to bring in Alex Bick. And Alex, I'm torn here. And so I'll do the Yogi Berra. When I come to a fork in the road, I'm going to take it. I'm torn from getting your insights and experience as a practitioner, as well as your insights and experiences as a historian of empire. What are you seeing in the current moment? You've been part of um, both the operational response to invasions in other parts of the world and also operations of the U.S. But we've heard of a shifting view of American empire from one that's global based on democracy to one that's hemispheric based on power. Where are your own eyes focusing?
Thanks, Bill, and agree with the comments that have been made so far, really illuminating. Let me take the operational side, and then I'll come to the historical one. I think on the operational one, I just want to pick up on the point that Dan began with, and Alan and Eric have elaborated about bedfellows. And I think I'd put it a slight, that policy involves strange bedfellows. I think part of what we've seen is a kind of policy incoherence, a series of objectives from different leaders within the administration, and that it's kind of Venn diagram where the overlap is enough, in a sense, among interests to approve the operation itself because it was short and sharp and spectacular, but not necessarily strong enough to support a coherent policy going forward. And I'll be more specific on that. So we've talked a bit about Rubio's interest in a political transition and signaling within the region in Cuba. We've talked about the president, his interest in oil and hemispheric power. But there's also Stephen Miller and the Homeland Security Advisor, both of whom have had, as I understand it, a pretty strong influence on this policy. And for them, the issues really are about drugs and immigrants coming into the United States, or migrants coming to the United States. And I think when you look at those three pieces of the Venn diagram, again, they overlapped enough to approve this operation and for Trump to feel that it was worth taking the risk, evidently feel it was worth taking the risk. But they don't overlap enough to get a coherent outcome. And what I mean by that is a legitimately elected government, in other words, an outcome politically consistent with what Marco Rubio, at least historically, has supported, is not going to allow the United States to siphon Venezuela's oil resources indefinitely. That's not going to work. And conversely, working with the remnants of the Maduro government, or really the entirety of the Maduro government minus Maduro, may bring stability and may bring concessions on oil, but it's not going to resolve the migration issues. It's not going to resolve the drug running issues, because those are the heart, in a sense, of the outcomes and the way that regime has functioned. And I would just add, in terms of hemispheric security, so long as we continue to support a rump regime, which is deeply unpopular in the region, not just with Venezuelans, but deeply unpopular within the region, we open up space for China and to a lesser extent Russia to play the seams that we're creating. In other words, we open up wedge opportunities for them going to states who fear the United States and fear what partnership with the United States will look like. And so, I think my practitioner experience says, look, if you have policy incoherence, you're setting the table for bad policy outcomes in the real world. And that's what I worry about looking forward, is that at some point the president is going to have to resolve the tensions among these policies. He generally does that by leaning towards the things that are most important to him, which I think in this case really is oil. But that has some pretty negative implications across those other areas which are of concern to the United States. Historically, I printed out a copy of the essay on neo-royalism last night. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But this is consistent, I think, with my own thinking. I'm publishing a book which will come out in May. Paradoxically, it's actually on the conquest of Brazil by the Dutch in the 17th century, which they did largely as a way to cut off Spanish imperial revenues from the Americas, because they were fighting a war in Europe that they couldn't win on land. And so they essentially exported the war to Latin America in order to win at home. And I guess what I'm seeing, which I think is quite striking, people have been talking about Trump's mercantilism really since 2017. That term sort of blew back into the public imagination. But largely, we were talking about trade. We were talking about tariff policy. We were talking about, to a lesser extent, industrial policy, and the manipulation of the economy to better suit national security interests. This is a new phase. Now we're talking about conquest. We're talking effectively about the seizure of other sovereign states' national resources by, in this case, coercion, military action followed by political coercion, in order to enrich the United States and potentially, by Trump's description, to drive down the price of oil globally. Now, that may have certain advantages for the United States, but it sets a very, very bad precedent for the behavior of states globally, and I think in ways that it would be very difficult for the United States to control in the medium and long term.
I want to focus in a second on some of the legitimacy questions that came through in those comments, but a quick lightning round for this group on particularly the relationship between the United States and Russia in this. I've seen two competing theories here. One, which was put as a question here by one of our viewers, Jim Webster, was there basically a deal between Trump and Putin where on the spheres of influence, the Americas are mine, Ukraine is yours. And a colleague of many of ours, Fiona Hill, said that this was a driving theme in the first Trump administration, and the reason for pressuring Vladimir Zelensky in one way or another had to do with exactly this theory. The other, though, is that it's actually mercantilism, and we've seen some evidence of that too, where the United States is actually not playing to the Venezuelans using Russian flags on ships as a way of covering this action. So a quick, say, 30 seconds from each of you is Putin part of this game, or is this game against Putin?
Well, Bill, I just say quickly, I mean, look, there are potentially some downside risks here for Putin in the long run, because as more Venezuelan crude, to Alan's point, starts flowing into U.S. refineries in the Gulf Coast and Texas and Louisiana that are built essentially to take that heavy crude and downmix it, that could drive revenues for Russian oil down, which could have very deleterious consequences for him. So it's not totally an unalloyed benefit for him. My suspicion is there's no specific deal here, although I suspect that people in the Trump administration figured that, Putin's, objections would be de minimis, which they have been so far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, Dan, please.
What Eric just said. Look, I think the most relevant deal here was probably with 1, 2, or 3 elements of the regime in Venezuela versus with Putin. And we can get into what those elements are and how much of it's part of the deal, because that's going to be really important going forward. The Russian crude versus Venezuelan crude, they're interchangeable, if you will. There's a finite amount of refining capacity that's built for it in the United States. And given the way global oil markets work, I think, if Venezuela comes back to the U.S. market, we were importing Russian because we stopped importing Venezuelan. We stopped importing Venezuelan. That went to China. It's so fungible that given the precise nature and the crudes are very similar, the Russian and Venezuelan, it will find refining capacity. I don't think it'll end up being a particularly big hit. I think Russia's role in Venezuela has been always overstated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Alex, do you want to get in on the Russia angle?
Yeah, the only thing I would respectfully disagree that this mercantilist view and the hemispheric view are distinct or incompatible. I think, in fact, they're two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
Just a couple things to add. I mean, I think on the oil point, and I'm not obviously an oil analyst, but my understanding is the Russian budget is built around $56 to $59 a barrel of oil. For this year, with the expectation that price would rise over $60 a barrel in the next fiscal cycle. And already Russia is selling its oil at discounted rates between $30 and $40 a barrel. And so clearly they've been able to manage continuing the war in Ukraine by spending off saved reserves and by other kinds of fiscal manipulation. But at some point, the guns and butter trade-off is going to begin to hit home. I've seen some analysts who think that point has already been reached and that this will exacerbate that problem. But I do think that's something that President Putin's going to have to worry about. And then I just say 2 other points, exaggerated or not, this is yet another relationship for Putin, which has just been effectively undermined, as was the relationship with Syria. So it's not a good story from a kind of Russian foreign policy perspective. And I would add to that, with the seizure of or the boarding and of these 2 ships just in the last 24 hours, one of them was being escorted by the Russian Navy. And the United States went, along with British Special Operations Forces, boarded and redirected that ship right under their nose. And I think what Russia is experiencing right now, I think Putin can take solace in the idea that the United States is moving towards a sphere of influence model. That's a solace he's had already for a year now. But operationally, episode after episode is exposing the weakness of Russia's ability to project its power and the relative strength of the United States.
I mean,
Thanks, Alex.
if I could
Yep,
just
please.
add briefly to what Alex just said. I mean, the fact that the U.S. is going after ships in the Ghost Fleet is not good news for Russia or Iran in the long run, either one of them. And both of them, I think, have to be a little bit concerned about what they just saw happen yesterday.
Really good. I want to focus back on the motivations the Trump administration gave and why they gave them, particularly that this was a legal action supported by the military and not a military operation. They seem very focused on that, even while talking quickly about oil and other things that were motivating. And on this, I want to bring in Mara Rudman and Bob Strong in particular. Mara has served in multiple administrations at the National Security Council and in diplomatic posts, but she's also served on Capitol Hill, and she knows the interests of senators and how senators might engage on this. We've already seen the administration backtrack after not giving any notifications to the Senate about this in advance, trying to justify this, trying to figure out which committees they should justify this to, and what the justification should be. So, Mara, just love your thoughts about this. First of all, can President Trump actually do this in the way that he did it? He obviously did do it, but is it based in U.S. law? And where does it go from here in the back and forth between the administration and Congress? We've already seen a few questions from the audience about the War Powers Act and the legality of this. Help us understand under American law how this actually works or should work.
Sure. Well, I think legislation aside, the War Powers Act historically has been quite troubled and probably followed in some ways, rarely followed in terms of congressional authorization. But this is a constitutional issue. I mean, just read Article 1, Article 2. They are in tension with each other, and I would argue fairly deliberately so. The authority to assert U.S. power overseas, and particularly with respect to military power. And in that context, I'd make the argument that Article 2, which is about the executive, really puts the president, who's commander-in-chief of the armed forces, in something of a COO position, whereas Article 1 would put Congress, the legislative body, and the CEO, in other words, the decision to strike, the decision to authorize the use of force. But this has been in tension for decades, not just under this administration. I'm going to do a slight modification, Bill, to what you said in terms of senators. The Senate would be quick to point out, or Senate staff would be quick to point out, that I'm a House person, that I was chief counsel to Lee Hamilton at the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And Dan and I have the experience of having worked for, I think Lee Hamilton is very similar in his mindset to Tim Kaine in terms of the importance of congressional authorization. But he also, and I believe he served on a Miller Center commission on this, which reflected where he had ended up legislatively, which is to try to mandate consultation, kind of somewhat giving up on the mandating authorization. I will say, as a quick aside, Dan and I had a very lonely experience of trying to push forward a vote on, it was Haiti authorization, wasn't it, Dan? Where we had less votes on the House floor in favor of authorizing than we would have had in a committee vote. In other words, that was how uncomfortable members were to take a vote on this kind of issue. So people should be realistic that it is fraught in terms of getting Congress to stand up and do its job, not just in this administration, on authorizations. That said, because of the risks involved, I would go back to Alex's point. This is a process issue as much as it's a legal issue. When you're going to involve and put at risk U.S. resources, U.S. treasure, what Lee Hamilton always said is that you should have the country with you on the takeoff if you want them with you on the landing. And that is represented by getting congressional buy-in for these things. And so President Trump, as recently as last night, apparently in a 2-hour interview with the New York Times, had indicated that he expects we're going to be in Venezuela for a long time. And it is just not smart in political or process terms to undertake an action like that and not even do the basic advance consultation with Congress, which has been fairly standard across prior administrations, Democratic and Republican. And Bill, on that, you don't have to come up with a new process. There's actually a written process. The Gang of Eight, a very exclusive group that does not leak, is who you bring in, even if you're concerned about a broader consultation. And then as soon as you go to a broader consultation, it's the committees of jurisdiction who have authorization power, whether or not they authorize, where authorization starts. So foreign affairs, foreign relations in the House and Senate, the key appropriations committees that write subcommittees that write the checks, and the armed services committees of both House and Senate. There's nothing new that has to be created on that. It's just following the pattern that, for good reason, has been followed in the past.
Thanks, Maura. Bob Strong wrote, is a senior fellow with us, started his career here at the Miller Center as a graduate student, getting his PhD at UVA, working in the oral histories, but wrote a terrific piece about for our Substack, comparing the Maduro operation with the operation that brought in Manuel Noriega during the Bush 41 administration. Bob, I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about, particularly with Maura talking about not just Congress, but the public mood behind these two operations and how they either might be similar or might be different, particularly the legal justification that this was really about narco trafficking.
Well, let me comment about the Rubio claim that the mission was primarily law enforcement. People tend to remember 1989 and the capture of Noriega as if it was a law enforcement operation, because there was a lot of drama connected to our capture of him. We brought him back to the United States. He stood trial on drug charges and eventually went to prison. But it wasn't a law enforcement operation. The President Bush, was presented with that option by the Pentagon. We'll send in a small team of people, they'll grab Noriega, it'll all be taken care of, and he rejected it. He rejected it because it wouldn't solve the fundamental problems of Panama. Most countries have an army. Panama was one of those places where the army had a country. And if you didn't do anything about the Panama Defense Forces, you'd just get rid of one dictator and open the door for another. So he sent in a very large American military operation, large particularly for a small country like Panama. And the primary mission was to defeat and defang the Panamanian Defense Forces so that there'd be an opportunity for a civilian president, the person who was actually elected in the last national election in Panama, to take power and assert civilian control over the nation's security forces. Panama was a regime change intervention, and a rare regime change intervention because it worked. Mostly they don't. We had trouble with regime change in Afghanistan, Iraq. We had trouble in the Bay of Pigs on the very first day. Panama was one of those instances where we really did produce a better Panama. The benefits from that intervention far exceeded the costs. So we shouldn't look back on it as a drug dealer being brought to justice. We should look back on it as a bigger and more important operation in terms of promoting democracy using military force. I don't think we're doing that in Venezuela. I don't think there's a plan to do that. And let me just make one other broad comment about your questions regarding relations with Congress and presidential powers. We're going to be talking about the second Trump administration for a very long time on the subject of presidential power. But it's primarily going to involve domestic powers, powers over the budget, powers over the bureaucracy, powers over a variety of institutions of power within the United States. I don't think we're going to see him as a president who dramatically expands American powers overseas, because those powers have been in existence for a very long time. They grew enormously during the Cold War, grew again after 9/11 and the War on Terror. Presidential authority to act with or without congressional approval is well established. We're going to judge Trump not by his expansion of American international powers, but whether he uses the existing powers wisely.
Really great.
Bill,
Bob, please, Eric, jump in.
Could I just add a couple of footnotes to what Bob just said in his comparison with the Noriega and Maduro events? Because I had some personal involvement in this back in December 1989, January 1990. And Bob will correct me if my recollection is incorrect, but my recollection is in the State Department, we put forward 3 justifications for the operation in Panama. First, the Panamanian Assembly, at Manuel Noriega's instance, had declared itself to be in a state of war with the United States. And so we asserted our right to defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Second, we'd had an incident at a PDF checkpoint. Bob was talking about the Panamanian Defense Forces, in which a Marine major was killed. 2 of his colleagues were beaten up. The wife of the one that they assailed was threatened, including with sexual violence. And so we asserted the defense of American citizens overseas. And third, we still had obligations under the Panama Canal Treaty to maintain the operation of that the canal would operate efficiently and effectively, even with all the unrest that was going on in Panama. And even with all that, the UN General Assembly found we'd violated Article 2 of the UN Charter and committed an act of aggression. Now, people forgot about it pretty quickly, as Bob points out, because we successfully moved the transition along to what had been the folks actually elected by Panamanians, set aside by Noriega earlier that year, and it was a successful, happy ending. But I make the point only to say that there's not even really much of a fig leaf here of legality. I mean, if we're going to assert that any time a federal grand jury indicts somebody, we can go in and snatch that person, it's a Pandora's box, I think, which we may live to regret.
Thank you, Eric. I wanted to go back to something that both Bob and Mara and others have mentioned, which is Cuba. We happen to have a lot of expertise on Cuba here at the Miller Center from 2 of our faculty members, Cristina Lopez Guittardi Chow, who actually was the inspiration behind the War Room and has been following these issues so closely as a scholar in her own right. Studies Cuba, Cuban Americans, and hemispheric policy. So, Cristina, as you've been watching all this, I'm sure you've had at least one eye on the Cuban angle. What are you seeing? And after Cristina, I'm going to pull in Mark Silverstone, the director of presidential studies, who's written a terrific case study of the failed Bay of Pigs operation. And this obviously was not from a military standpoint a failure. Both current Cuba and U.S.-Cuban history, what are you both seeing on this operation?
Thanks, Bill. I think there's certainly a lot to unpack when it comes to Cuba, and I appreciate the comments that have already been made by Dan and others related to the Cuba angle, related to Secretary Rubio's role in all of this. But I think first, for context, it's probably useful to just sort of take a step back and to understand a little bit more about the nature of Venezuela's relationship with Cuba. So in the last 20 years or so, it's now becoming more well known that there have been very strong ties between the 2 countries. And this partnership, of course, dates back to 1999 when Hugo Chavez first came to power and he forged a relationship with then President Fidel Castro. At that time, they shared, of course, they shared a very deep commitment to socialist ideology. And then that relationship rested on political, economic, and ideological support between the 2 of them. I think in practical terms, that meant that Venezuela has provided Cuba with oil and oil subsidies for some time. And then in exchange for Cuban expertise, mostly in the form of personnel for security and intelligence services, medical doctors for Venezuela's healthcare system, and in other areas, right? In Saturday's strikes, it's now been reported that 70 or so of those that were killed, 32 were Cubans. And so presumably those folks were there, providing Maduro with security around him and his family. And so that certainly tells us something about how coordinated and in sync these two countries have been for many years. I think on the question of whether Cuba is next and is it likely to fall, certainly the Trump administration statements on this have been somewhat confusing. I think on the one hand, President Trump and Secretary Rubio have both kind of put Cuba on notice. They've put their leadership on notice, and given the strike on Saturday, given comments laid out in the national security strategy, we may need to take the administration at its word on this. But when pressed, as Dan said, Trump's comments about it falling seem more to imply that he believes Cuba might fall on its own accord as a result of Cuba's own economic situation at the moment. And then coupled with kind of the final loss of Venezuelan oil support that might put, the island over the edge economically and then politically as well. Cuba's revolution just started its 67th year in existence on January 1st. That's a very long time. And sadly for the Cuban people, it's safe to say that the island is going through its worst economic crisis. There's also a very related and deep energy crisis taking place on the island. And so as much as 40% of the country is without power during peak times, that has obvious ramifications for sort of the functioning of everyday life, for even the refrigeration of food. Trash pickup has become a problem in Cuba. There's worries about sanitation, disease. So it's a very dire situation. That said, Cuba's leadership remains firmly committed to its system. The armed forces are very embedded in that, and they benefit from the system that exists. And so a transition there would not be easy, but there have been elements of the Cuban opposition or Cuban society that have been putting pressure upon the government. I think the most kind of illustrative example of that was in July of 2021, when there were nationwide protests throughout Cuba. They were pretty significant in that they occurred not just in Havana, but throughout provinces around the island. They were clamped down eventually through repressive tactics, jailings, forced exile, all sorts of things. But maybe that holds promise. Maybe if things get more dire economically, maybe there will be kind of a broader outpouring into the streets. And then, the Cuban leadership is going to have to decide how they respond to that. So Cuba is in a bad situation, and I think we're just going to have to wait and see what happens.
Thanks, Mark. As you look back in history, you've seen not just the interventions successful and failed, or at least failed in Cuba, but successful perhaps in other ways like Panama, across Latin America. What is history telling you today about where we stand and where we may be going?
Thanks. Well, it's important to, I think, put the whole conversation in context as we think about intervention in Latin America. And those conversations usually take us back a lot further to the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, but they're rooted really in interpretations of the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which has already been brought up. Just to highlight what that was about, the Monroe Doctrine sought to prevent Europe from meddling in the Americas, essentially in the wake of the Spanish Empire falling apart. But I'd note that the doctrine wasn't really designed to support U.S. intervention in the hemisphere. It was designed to keep Europe out of the hemisphere. And there was also an element of reciprocity at work, in which not only was Europe to stay out of Western hemispheric affairs, but the United States was to stay out of European affairs as well. So as we think about corollaries to the doctrine and thinking about Greenland in this context, we should keep that in mind. As far as the interventions, though, I would say that as Washington's ambitions grew after the Civil War, that policy of Europe staying out of hemispheric affairs became married more to an interventionist approach within the Americas, which was rooted in realpolitik motives of self-interest, as well as the idealism of supporting or nurturing or even establishing democracies. And this is what led the United States into war with Spain at the end of the 19th century and the absorption of Spanish colonies following its conclusion, with one of those indeed being Cuba, which the United States essentially viewed as a protectorate, with the Platt Amendment, which I think has already been highlighted before, empowering Washington to intervene in Cuban affairs, the amendment being introduced to a military appropriations bill in 1901, but then that language actually getting grafted into the Cuban Constitution itself. And then the policy gets grafted onto a host of other states in the region. And this is where the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine comes in, as Eric had alluded to, where the United States established these neo-colonial relationships at times through military intervention in a host of states, either to ward off European adventurism or to support U.S. business interests, or through a missionary impulse to foster democracy through electing good men, as Woodrow Wilson aspired to. And perhaps the most infamous of these interventions came in 1961, Bill, when the Kennedy administration tried to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba with really disastrous consequences, including the impact of throwing Castro even more firmly into the arms of the Soviet Union. And it's important to highlight the geopolitical and ideological context here of the Cold War, where there were quasi or perhaps even real existential concerns at work. In terms of the operational terms, and you had asked about, differences between then and now, I would just note that the Bay of Pigs operation happened really early in the Kennedy administration, where people didn't really know each other as well, weren't as comfortable asking the questions that they probably should have asked. And this operation comes like a full year into the Trump administration, where people have had an opportunity to become more comfortable with each other, which I think is an important dimension. In terms of the broader perspective, what this means, the interventionist impulse has gone hand in glove with a more expansive presidency. Circumstances matter greatly. FDR was an empowered president, if there ever was one, but he actually sought to reverse course and establish the good neighbor policy of improving relations with Latin American states, doing away with that protectorate approach that had obtained since the first decade of the 20th century. And this is part of what Eric had suggested regarding the Fortress America, but it came in the context of trying to shore up allies as the war clouds darkened in Europe. But I'd also say that those earlier interventions seem to have a coherence that addressed real challenges to American well-being, whether it was the perceived threats of European imperialism or international communism. There was something quasi-existential at work. There is an element of coherence here, as Dan and Alan have highlighted, with respect to a return to a world of regions, but the rationales really do seem to be more opportunistic, more nakedly acquisitive, as Alex highlighted, and certainly less grounded in idealism, as we've seen at various stages in the past, even while acknowledging that few tears are being shed about the fate of Maduro personally.
Thank you, Mark. This is such a rich conversation. We tend to, and we do a really good job, I think, in our public events to staying on time. But we've got so many questions in from our audience, and with the willingness of members of this group, if they can, to stay on a little bit longer, we'll go into overtime. So for those at home and those here, if people need to leave, feel free to, but we'll keep going for a little bit longer. Christina, do you want to get in?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. There's an interesting, I think, parallel also with the Platt Amendment. So similar to the way that Trump has argued that one of the motivations for this action is to recover U.S. oil assets that were sort of nationalized under Chavez, a similar argument was actually made regarding the Platt Amendment, in the sense that the U.S. sort of was making the argument that it had to protect U.S. Sugar investments in Cuba at the time. And so just kind of another interesting historical parallel that I thought was worth mentioning.
Thank you for that, Christina. I am curious to maybe extend the conversation. We've seen questions about this come in from our audience. Comment on Europe, Greenland, Denmark, NATO. As in the Trump view of hemispheric security, democracy is a missing element. I'm reminded, Mark, in the period of the Monroe Doctrine, as you suggested correctly, Europe did not want the United States meddling in its internal affairs, and its big internal affair at the moment was a revolution in Greece that was a democratic revolution against the Ottoman Empire. And the European Christian monarchs didn't want the United States getting involved because they were still living with the memory of the Napoleonic revolutions that had gripped Europe. And basically, the United States said, "Okay, we'll tend to our own region where we'd like them to be in the Jeffersonian era, more democracies." Here we have the United States thinking about Greenland and democratic allies in NATO standing up. So I'm curious if people would comment on the expansion of the hemispheric ambitions of the Trump administration to Greenland and what that could mean moving forward. Weirdly, in a moment of military operations in Venezuela, we're also talking about potentially seizing Greenland. I'm curious how that's echoing through the system. Mara.
Thanks, Bill. I'd say I think this is part of the folly of trying to put kind of scholarly theoretical frames on what this administration is doing. I think Mark just now was kind in saying something about this does not reflect as much of kind of either long-term planning or value-based structures. This does not reflect that at all. Okay, this is entirely opportunistic. I would argue that looking at kind of regional sphere of influence is opportunistic for this administration, in that they have looked at the things that they want or that they feel like they need, either I'd say they personally or theoretically on behalf of the country, and are looking for routes to grab it. And so, for example, minerals, not, yes, oil as a resource, but minerals throughout the world. We've seen the deal with Ukraine on minerals that people have already forgotten about given our time, our attention span. Greenland is huge in that respect, as well as, other security issues, though at the same time, we had 5 military bases in Greenland. We have 1 now. And so there's not, I just don't think there's long-term planning. And I think that the regional aspect is itself opportunistic. And so, what we want and what we feel like we need, we will find a way to get. I believe that was essentially Stephen Miller's comments just in the last couple of days. And so part of what he does and what others in the administration do is to state the private thoughts out loud and publicly. And I don't think they deserve the grace of an academic, scholarly, theoretical frame to justify their actions.
Dan Restrepo, you were trying to get in, I think.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on Greenland, then I wanted to go back to Cuba for a second. So absolutely, Greenland's opportunistic. I also think, and this is going to be said as somebody who's worked on the Americas for the last 30 years, where both the kind of common critique is we haven't been paid enough attention. I always warn people, be careful what you wish for, because U.S. attention in the global space is usually drawn by negativity or creates negativity. But it's striking as somebody who works on the Americas that, yes, Stephen Miller has talked about Greenland a great deal, and the notion of attacking a NATO ally is nuts, to use the technical term. But they're also talking about military actions again in our largest trading partner in the world, which is Mexico. And that has kind of like nobody, like the shiny object that is the transatlantic relationship has drawn a ton of the attention to that issue. I think we should be careful not to lose track of things that they're thinking about that are could have really consequential. Again, Greenland is seriously consequential, but so would attacks on Mexico, even if not the Mexican government, given that Mexico is our #1 trading partner in the world, is one. The second, and just real quick on Cuba, to agree and add to something Christina said. The theory of the case here on Cuba is that you're going to precipitate a social collapse that is going to precipitate a regime collapse. I think Cuba has shown that those two things are not the same thing. You've already had societal collapse in Cuba. Like the crisis we are seeking to precipitate occurred precisely when Christina said in July, and the social reaction to it It occurred in July of 2021. On July 11th, 2021, you had the first real popular uprising since the Cuban Revolution itself, and the regime ruthlessly put it down, and have continued. In the social circumstances have gotten worse every day since July 11th of 2021, and nothing has popped up. So this notion that we're going to push them over some sort of magical cliff that is going to bring the regime down because of societal collapse, I think is the wrong way to think about Cuba. I think the scary way to think about Cuba and the unfortunate way to think about Cuba and kind of what this all precipitates is Haiti closer and bigger. Cuba is more and more like Haiti, but it's 90 miles from the United States and it's roughly 3 times the population.
So Dan, just to extend that to you, and maybe Christina, you would want to get in here. We have seen Cuban boat lifts before and Cuban migration crises. We have not seen one of those recently. We've seen the Venezuela migration crisis. Are you suggesting that we could be seeing something like that?
Absolutely. So a couple of things. We haven't seen it, but it's been going on, Bill.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a mass migration from Cuba. Cuba has shed 10% of its population in the last 2 years. And it shed that 10% largely to Mexico, and pieces of it still into the United States, but it occurs in a way that kind of because of the status, what was the special status of Cubans in the United States, it occurred in a way that didn't draw attention.
Mm-hmm.
Mara and I actually worked on kind of the last major Caribbean mass migration crisis, which was in August of 1994, which was a simultaneous crisis. It was the Balsero crisis in the case of Cuba, folks getting on anything that would float and risking their lives in the Florida Straits. It was simultaneous to a Haitian mass exodus. We weren't well prepared to deal with it then. We're much less well prepared to deal with it today. And the possibility of that kind of humanitarian disaster unfolding in the Florida Straits, I think, increases with each passing day, particularly if the administration seeks to strong-arm the Mexicans into cutting off their energy supplies to Cuba.
Mm-hmm. Christina, you were trying to get in.
Yeah, I think what's an interesting parallel to the August 94 rafter crisis, the Balsero crisis, that was coming a couple years after the loss of Soviet subsidies, right? And so there's that similar kind of parallel of, when Cuba lost Soviet support, then eventually they gained Venezuelan support. And so they've had sort of this benefactor. But now it is, and this isn't sudden. They have been losing Venezuelan support as Venezuela's economy has deteriorated. And so it's not all of a sudden now. It's the question of will they be finally cut off? But as Dan says, they do get some oil from Mexico and I believe from Russia. I don't know what that amount is, if it's sufficient. But it's a big question. I think another part of the Cuba equation is, for elites, for the military, which is what keeps things in order there. I mean, repression, I can't stress enough how tough a situation it is for opposition, for just citizens on the island. If the benefits that they're getting economically right now from the existing system, if those things begin to go away entirely, will that then potentially, create some openings behind the scenes? The current president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, is a Castro-appointed successor. Raul Castro is I think he's like 94 years old, but he's believed to still be behind the scenes and has some symbolic presence there. And so, I think it's a question mark. How will elites respond if economics are so shut down that they no longer kind of get benefits from the existing system?
Christina, those exact points, I'm curious to the entire group. How do they play out back to Venezuela? We had mentioned before and touched on, but didn't go into great detail about why the Trump administration stuck with basically the Maduro regime minus Maduro, as opposed to the Democratic opposition, which apparently actually did win the last round of elections. The Nobel Peace Prize winning vice presidential candidate, who is everyone looks to as the potential leader, has been looked past by the Trump administration. What are the levers of power that the current regime in Venezuela has, and why is the Trump administration not wrestling with that?
Can I be quick?
And to the extent that they're not, and President Trump says we're running Venezuela, what does that actually mean?
Right. So I think quickly, and this is actually a really interesting contrast with Cuba. There are no factions in the Cuban regime, right? The Cuban military is running the show, full stop. And it's a hierarchical institution that has operated for 67 years pretty effectively. The Venezuelan regime, essentially think of it as kind of three-legged stool, if you will. There's been a political element, a military element, and an intelligence element. The political element until this weekend was led by Nicolas Maduro, but Delcy Rodriguez and her brother Jorge have been very important players in that political space, and quite frankly have better ties to kind of traditional Chavismo political than Maduro himself ever had. Then you have the military under the leadership of Vladimir Padrino, and then you have the intelligence / paramilitary organizations under the control of a guy named Diosdado Cabello. One of the big questions, I mentioned this at the top, one of the big questions is the deal was clearly cut with elements of that three-legged stool. The question is whether it was 2 or 3, because I think it's undoubtedly the political and the military. It was a remarkable U.S. military operation from a tactical perspective, but I think it was probably helped by the fact that the Venezuelan military is not shedding a lot of tears, that Cuban VIP protection took the brunt of the hit. They have not enjoyed the Cuban presence, the military as an institution, and so I think you clearly had those two. The real question is, did you also have Diosdado Cabello and the paramilitary structures? There's been a decent amount of repression by those paramilitary structures in the course of the last couple of days. I think it's still TBD if that's performative or if that is actually a power struggle between Diosdado and the rest. I think the administration's theory of the case, and not to give an academic glean to this, Mara, because I think it's practical. It's one of two things. The president said it out loud. If Delcy Rodriguez doesn't play ball, she'll meet a fate worse than Nicolas Maduro. Presumably that means we will kill her. The other theory that they're running with, and this is articulated more by Secretary Rubio, is by controlling the oil sector, we will essentially coerce them to do what we want them to do. That this is kind of an extortion racket, if you will, and that they will bend to our will, first in control of the sector itself, and then maybe this kind of nebulous transition. The question is one of the things the thing that led to coherence in Venezuela before all of this is that the cash flow. Venezuela is a strange country. It's essentially a failed state with cash flow, and the cash flow was sufficient both from oil and other illicit revenue to keep all the bad guys with guns on the same side of the equation. If the U.S. actually meaningfully disrupts that through this kind of siphoning off of Venezuelan oil and the money that goes with it, will that create the tension within the regime, further destabilizing the country? And then the U.S. faces the question, do you just let the place blow up with all the externalities that come with it, or do you do something about it? To actually change that regime, you had to have broken it. And breaking it leads necessarily to instability, leads to a bunch of negative externalities. They made a decision not to break it, but rather to take one member for kind of political payoff purposes and a bunch of the other reasons we've talked about, and see if we could grab the oil sector and use it coercively and to enrich people who are kind of closest to the industry.
Dan, let me just a quick follow-up there, as we've got about 5 minutes left. Isn't there a bit of a contradiction in that? If the U.S. is going to take the revenues, including to lower the price of oil so Americans can address affordability issues, we've seen questions about that in terms of U.S. support for the operation, doesn't that mean bleeding the current regime? But if you bleed the current regime, forget about collapse, can they keep producing the oil that we need? Are we really looking at more of a joint venture here rather than us running the country?
So it's worse than that. So at best, it's a joint venture. But the joint venture is running a sector that will meaningfully affect the global price of oil in a sustainable way 10 years and billions of dollars of investment from today, right? The Venezuelan oil sector, oil exploration and production is heavily CapEx intensive. There's been very little investment in the sector. It has been sanctioned variously at different points and in different ways over the course of the last 15 years. The sector is in disrepair. The nature of Venezuelan crude and the nature of where the refining capacity is, and the changes in the global oil markets that have taken place, particularly the shale revolution in the United States, since Venezuela was last a major market player, all mean that this joint venture, even if it worked, will work a decade from now to provide meaningful revenue. But if you squeeze it in the way we just talked about, you're going to buy yourself a lot of instability much earlier than a decade from now.
Mm-hmm. Christina, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to, before we close, I wanted to mention also the fact that there's a number of rogue actors also that sort of run sort of like the Wild West, I think, in Venezuela. A number of there have been claims about Hezbollah, about other Iranian influences, about Colombian groups, gangs, the drug traffickers, the FARC. That's going to have to be part of the transition, and the United States is going to have to deal with that. And so I just think it's worth mentioning. And then also to Dan's earlier point, I just also want to just really stress, I think, the role of the Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello, just to say a little bit more about him. I think by most accounts, he's considered to be the most powerful figure. He could pose, obviously, a threat internally to Delcy Rodriguez. He's said to be very ideologically fervent, violent. He has a lot of sympathy within the military, and that's important. He also manages, sort of has sway over these colectivos, these sort of pro-Maduro militias that run around on motorcycles, intimidating and harassing. And there's been reports since Saturday that they've been sort of setting up at checkpoints, checking people's cell phones to see what kind of messages they're sending out, or social media messages to see whether or not they're, you know, they're in favor of the U.S. invasion or not. So I think he's a really key figure, and he's someone that we just need to really watch closely going forward.
So,
Bill, could I just say one thing?
Yeah.
And I'd be interested in Dan and Christina's reaction. It seems to me that we're in the sort of, if you could call it a honeymoon phase of this partnership between the U.S. government and mostly Delcy Rodriguez, who is the main interlocutor for Secretary Rubio, but that this could go sideways very quickly. I mean, right now they're talking about, you know, getting the oil to American refineries, figuring out how they split the proceeds and all that. That's relatively easy because it you know, keeps the whole thing greased and moving. The other elements of the U.S. agenda that Secretary Rubio has suggested, that we want them to break with Cuba, break with Iran, break with Russia, control migration, you know, take returnees back who've been given TSP here in the United States, or TPS in the United States. Those are going to be a lot harder for them to do. I mean, first of all, I'm not sure they can control migration at all. But on the breaking with Cuba, you know, good luck getting the Interior Minister to do that. His whole operation's completely, you know, penetrated by the Cubans.
Yes and no. So the reason Nicolas Maduro succeeded Hugo Chavez and not Diosdado Cabello is that the Cubans preferred Nicolas because the Cubans didn't trust Diosdado. Diosdado, I agree with most of what Christina said about Diosdado. He's not an ideal. He is a ruthless, pragmatic dude who's about power and money. And he will do he will do what's necessary to maintain power and to maximize profit. And so if the best deal available is to cut off the Cubans, Diosdado would do it, and the Cubans have known that for quite some time. The first Trump administration tried, back in the Juan Guaido uprising moment with the interim president, it was reported afterwards that the deal there that the Trump administration tried cutting was with Diosdado, actually, was with Diosdado and Padrino, the head of the military. You can't do anything without the head of the military. Like, the military matters. It's the largest group of guys with guns in the country, to oversimplify things. And so Diosdado he may be penetrated by the Cubans, but he also didn't shed any tears that the Cubans had a bad weekend Because again, most of the casualties were Cubans over the weekend in Venezuela, which is telling, and they were most closely tied to Maduro.
So to bring us to close, by the way, thank you to all. This was terrific. And thanks to the audience for your wonderful questions, which I know we'll be chewing on for some time. I want to do a final lightning round of 15 seconds each. We've seen military interventions in the past. Many of you have been practitioners who have watched them both elsewhere and from the United States. Historians and political scientists, we're at the end of the beginning, perhaps. We may even be at the beginning of the beginning. What is the one thing you're watching in 15 seconds? And I'll close with Dan. So let me start with Alan Stamm, and I'll call on you each. What's the one thing you're watching, Alan?
What's happening in Cuba and Iran?
Bob Strong.
I'm more worried about how Trump might use American military force within the United States than outside.
Alex Bick.
I worked on Syria, I worked on Libya, I worked on Mali, I worked on Venezuela even at one time, and the two words that I hear in this conversation are failed state.
Eric Edelman.
Yeah, I agree with what Alex just said, but I'm keeping an eye on Greenland because I take Dan's point about Mexico, but an attack on a NATO ally would be a major perturbation in the international system that would, set off all sorts of earthquakes.
Mark Silverstone.
Congressional engagement and efforts to try to rein in the president, balance of power issues.
Maura.
I play off of what Mark said, the extent of potential political turmoil in the United States, because this action is just one of kind of many, but at what point does the house of cards fall apart?
Christina?
Certainly Cuba. And I think, there's no doubt that this is a difficult and controversial and contentious situation, but looking for a better future for the Venezuelan people who have been living in under very difficult circumstances for a very long time. So just also reminding ourselves that that is a reality on the ground and hoping for a better future for them.
And Dan, having you help us bring this to a close.
So I'm going to go back to Mexico and the possibilities of corruption that could make Food for Oil look like a tea party in terms of how the U.S. and the president, who claims he will be personally deciding where the funds go from this joint venture that the U.S. is now engaged in with the regime in Venezuela.
Well, thank you all. For what it's worth, I'm watching the internal machinations of the Trump administration. As Mark pointed out, we're at the end of the first year. They're better than they were at the beginning, but with the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State being the same person who has at least 3 other positions in the U.S. government right now, in particular, whether Marco Rubio can keep it together, and where has J.D. Vance been and where will he be? And with that, I want to thank this terrific group and our great audience for joining us and with the great set of questions. We'll see you all soon when we resume our programming, both online and in person here at the Miller Center. And our whole team who pulled this together, thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.